Donald Trump has sat through thousands of interviews in his life. Hostile interviews, friendly interviews, campaign interviews, presidential interviews, town halls, debates, press conferences. For decades, Trump's greatest political strength has been his ability to dominate a conversation. Whether you agree with him or not, one thing has always been true. Trump rarely lets anyone control the room. He talks over people. He redirects questions. He changes subjects. He attacks the premise. He attacks the messenger. And most of the time, it works. Most of the time, he finds a way to escape uncomfortable questions before they become a problem. But what happened during this interview was different. Because for nearly an hour, Donald Trump looked increasingly frustrated, increasingly defensive, and increasingly unable to escape the questions being thrown his way. At first, it was subtle. A shorter answer here, a defensive response there, an interruption, a change of subject. Then the tension started building. His voice got louder. His answers got longer. His patience got thinner. And eventually, what started as a routine interview turned into one of the most uncomfortable television moments of his presidency. A visibly angry Donald Trump throwing down his microphone, attacking the interviewer, calling the press corrupt, calling elections rigged, refusing to answer direct questions, and ultimately storming off set entirely. If you've only seen the viral clip of him walking away, you're missing the most important part. Because the meltdown wasn't caused by one question. It wasn't caused by one answer. And it definitely wasn't caused by the rain, despite what some people would later try to claim. This was a slow-motion collapse that had been building for nearly the entire interview. And once you see the full sequence of events, it becomes very clear why Trump became so angry. Because every major topic in this interview forced him into a contradiction. Every answer created a new problem, and every attempt to escape one issue only led directly into another. By the end, it felt less like an interview and more like watching someone desperately try to plug holes in a sinking ship. So let's walk through the entire sequence from beginning to end because the context here matters. And trust me, the ending is even worse when you understand everything that happened before. Before we get into the actual interview, it's important to understand the political backdrop. Trump entered this interview at a difficult moment. The administration was facing growing criticism over its handling of the conflict involving Iran. Questions were mounting about inflation. Questions were mounting about energy prices. Questions were mounting about whether Trump was actually delivering on many of the promises that helped get him elected. And perhaps most importantly, questions were mounting about whether Trump was becoming increasingly disconnected from the reality many Americans were experiencing. Because while the White House continued describing the economy as strong, many Americans felt something very different. The cost of living remained a major concern. Household budgets were under pressure. Many industries were struggling. And one group in particular had become impossible to ignore: farmers. For months, reports had been emerging showing increasing financial strain across large portions of rural America. Higher operating costs, higher fuel costs, higher fertilizer costs, tighter profit margins, growing debt burdens. The exact voters who helped deliver key victories for Trump were now increasingly expressing concern about their economic future. That's important because it creates pressure. And pressure is what makes interviews dangerous. When politicians are riding high, interviews are easy. When politicians are facing criticism from multiple directions at once, every question becomes a potential landmine. That's the situation Trump walked into. And the first major landmine appeared almost immediately: Iran. The conflict had become one of the most controversial foreign policy issues facing the administration. For years, Trump had built his political identity around a simple message: America should stop getting dragged into endless foreign wars. It was one of the central themes of his political movement. He repeated it at rallies. He repeated it in speeches. He repeated it during campaigns. Again and again, Trump positioned himself as the candidate who would keep America out of costly overseas conflicts. So when Kristen Welker asked a straightforward question about whether the United States was effectively at war with Iran, Trump faced a serious problem. Because no matter how he answered, he risked exposing a contradiction. If he admitted the conflict had become a war, critics would immediately point out that he had broken one of his biggest promises. If he denied it was a war, he would have to explain why American forces, American resources, and American military operations were heavily involved in the region. There was no easy answer, and you could see that almost immediately. Instead of directly addressing the question, Trump attempted to minimize the situation. He described Iran as weakened. He emphasized American military strength. He focused on military capabilities rather than the broader strategic question being asked. It was a familiar strategy. When the question is uncomfortable, redirect attention towards something easier to defend. The problem was that the question didn't go away, because the underlying issue remained. If America isn't at war, then what exactly is happening? And if America is at war, how does that square with years of promises about avoiding new foreign conflicts? The more Trump talked, the more difficult that contradiction became to ignore. Then came another problem: results. Because military action is ultimately judged by outcomes. What was achieved? What changed? What concessions were secured? What strategic objectives were accomplished? Those are the questions people naturally begin asking whenever military force is used. And that's where critics argue the administration has struggled. The administration repeatedly highlighted damage inflicted on adversaries. But critics continued asking a different question. What did America actually gain? And that's where the conversation became increasingly uncomfortable. Because destroying military assets is one thing. Achieving political objectives is another. The interviewer continued pressing. Trump continued defending. And little by little, the frustration started becoming visible. But the Iran discussion was only the beginning. The next section of the interview created an even bigger problem. Because eventually the conversation moved away from foreign policy and toward campaign promises. Specifically, Trump's repeated promise to avoid endless wars. At this point, Trump attempted a different strategy. Instead of defending the contradiction, he began challenging the premise itself. He suggested he never made certain promises. He suggested critics were mischaracterizing his position. But there's a problem with that approach. People remember, campaign speeches exist. Video exists. Public statements exist. Years of rhetoric exist. And when those statements are compared directly against current events, difficult questions naturally emerge. The interviewer continued pushing. The pressure continued building. And Trump's answers became increasingly defensive. The conversation was no longer about policy. It was becoming about credibility. And that's a much harder battle to win. Then came the topic that appeared to trigger the most emotional reaction of the entire interview. January 6th. The moment this subject entered the conversation, everything changed. The pace changed. The tone changed. Trump's demeanor changed. Suddenly, the discussion became far more personal, far more emotional, far more confrontational. Because unlike foreign policy debates, January 6th touches something deeper. It touches Trump's identity, touches his supporters. It touches his narrative about the 2020 election. And it touches questions that have followed him for years. The interviewer specifically pressed Trump on efforts to compensate certain January 6 defendants. And that's where things started spiraling. At first, Trump defended the idea. Then he reframed the issue. Then he shifted the conversation toward alleged government misconduct. Then he pivoted toward law enforcement. Then he pivoted toward political opponents. Then he pivoted toward the media. Each answer seemed less focused on the original question. Each response moved further away from the issue at hand. And every attempt to redirect only seemed to make the interviewer press harder. You could actually watch the frustration building in real time. Trump leaned forward. His voice became sharper. He interrupted more frequently. His answers became longer and less focused. It was as if every question was adding another layer of pressure. Then came the discussion about election integrity. And this is where the interview truly began breaking apart. Because once election fraud claims entered the conversation, the possibility of a calm exchange essentially disappeared. The interviewer asked for evidence. Trump responded with accusations. The interviewer asked for specifics. Trump responded with broader claims. The interviewer attempted to return to facts. Trump expanded the argument into a larger attack on institutions. At this point, the interview wasn't really an interview anymore. It was a battle over reality itself. One side asking for proof. The other side insisting the proof was obvious. Neither side willing to move. Neither side willing to concede. and every minute made the tension more obvious. Trump became visibly angry. The interruptions increased. The accusations increased. The volume increased. The conversation was no longer moving forward. It was collapsing. Then came the moment where everything finally boiled over. The interviewer continued pressing. Trump continued attacking. The exchange became increasingly personal. Suddenly the discussion wasn't about Iran. It wasn't about January 6th. It wasn't about policy. It wasn't even about elections. It became about the media itself. Trump accused the press of being dishonest. He accused networks of being corrupt. He accused journalists of knowingly misleading the public. The interviewer pushed back. Trump escalated further. And then it happened. Trump abruptly ended the conversation. The microphone came off. The interview was over. He stood up. He continued criticizing the press. He continued attacking the interviewer. And then he walked away. Just like that, the discussion ended. No resolution. No final answer. No clarification. Just frustration, anger, and an exit. The reason this moment went so viral isn't because politicians getting angry is unusual. Politicians get angry all the time. The reason it went viral is because it revealed something much deeper. It revealed what happens when a politician who normally controls every conversation suddenly loses control of one. For nearly an hour, Trump tried every tool that has worked for him for years. Redirection, counterattacks, media criticism, election claims, personal attacks, topic changes. But this time, none of those tactics stopped the questions from coming. And that's what made the final moments so revealing. Whether you're a supporter or a critic, the image left behind was impossible to ignore. A president who entered the interview expecting to dominate the conversation. And a president who ultimately walked away from it. Because by the end, the questions he didn't want to answer had become bigger than the answers he was willing to give. And that's why this interview will likely be remembered long after the policy details are forgotten. Not because of what was said, but because of how it ended.